Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the show. I have a very special guest with me today. This is Ben Yalom, who is a psychotherapist, author, and well versed in the world of theaters and art. Welcome, Ben. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
I'm very excited for not only having a conversation with you, but diving into the world of art, of therapy, mental health, especially in the digital world. But before we get into those topics, tell me a bit about yourself. What would you like viewers to know about you and your life?
Yeah, well, it's 55 years now, so that could take a while, but let's pick a couple of highlights that are relevant to what we're talking about. Um, I am a psychotherapist, relatively new to it, though. I came to psychotherapy as a second career. My first career was as a theater maker. I was artistic director and founder of a company called Fool's Fury in San Francisco. And I guess I would call it an experimental company, but in the sense that we created work by experimenting and by doing things that we didn't know the answer, so we went in to explore. And what that sort of means is in San Francisco, people called us experimental, and in New York, people said, well, yeah, I don't know, they're pretty cool, but not experimental. And I sort of felt like that was kind of just the right spot because there's a certain amount of so-called experimental art where audiences often come in and then leave feeling like either they got it and they're in the in crowd, or I didn't get that and it must be my fault. So they end up feeling a little dumb. And my work was very much about telling stories that everybody can understand and be surprised by. So that's a bit of the theater work. We can talk more about how that impacts the therapy work and why the transition later, as it makes sense to you. But a couple of things happened for me. One, my father, Irvin Yalom, is very well known in the therapy world. So I actually avoided going into therapy as a practitioner, lots of therapy as a client, a patient. But
Same.
but I really avoided it for 30 years. I didn't want to be in his shadow. And at a certain later stage of my life, I had children, and being a theater maker in America isn't great for being a responsible, present parent for most people. Some people manage it. And then we moved away from San Francisco to be in San Diego, where my wife is from and where her career was taking off. And so the distance and the difficulty of the career, specifically with parenting, was a challenge. And I started to think maybe there's something else I could do. Uh, but I really held on to my identity as a theater maker. And I think that's identity is such a big issue for people that we may talk about that a bit. But eventually, and I started to think, well, there are other things I could do. I don't know. I don't really want to make that change. And then COVID came and shut down every theater in the world, literally. So it literally took every theater in the world being shut down for me to step back enough and say, well, come on, Yalam, you could do something else. Um, and at that point, I started looking around all the people I'd known through my parents and family friends, and wow, they were pretty interesting people. And they were making their livings doing work that really helped other people flourish or recover. And I thought, you know what, at this age, I don't need to worry about being in my father's shadow. That is what it is, one way or another. And maybe I could learn from my father, which I have done a lot of. Um, and it seemed like a really good place for a second part of my life. And unfortunately, I've really found ways to combine with the theater work and the therapy work. But that's how I get to where I am. It may be relevant. I'll mention the book, Hour of the Heart, my father's final book, probably, um, is a collection of stories about patients that he saw for a very brief period, so one session only, because his memory was really going and he didn't feel like he could responsibly be a long-term therapist. But in the writing of that, he found that he just couldn't manage to hold all the ideas together. So I took on collaborating with him in that. We'd done some collaboration in the past, and this became my first real significant writing project about therapy. Uh, and finally felt competent, like I had things to say, So the book is out now. It's called Hour of the Heart, and it's a real collaboration between myself and my father. And that kind of brings us to where we are now.
I love that. And you are, as you mentioned earlier, you are in this journey of new to psychotherapy, bridging that. I would not in so much of gap per se, but this journey, if you will. And what are you working on now? Are there visions or things that are being birthed in your heart when it comes to your journey?
Absolutely. I like how you say that, things that are being birthed in my heart. There are lots of things that have to be done, and they're not all things that are birthed in my heart.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
like licensing and hours and all of that. The thing that I'm really drawn to at the moment is, well, to take one step back, the transition from theater to therapy makes a lot of sense to me because at heart, what I found most compelling about my theater work was not audiences and applause or whatever. It was the deep inner experience and journey that we as artists were going on and then sharing with our audiences. And when we were most successful, the audiences were having transformative experiences as well. So the goal, and it's very different from maybe mainstream theater, that is more, can be more about entertainment, which is great, not a problem. But the very difficult task that we set up for ourselves in Fool's Fury had a lot to do with self-exploration. And so when I started thinking about transitioning to therapy, this made sense in the idea that both fields are ultimately about transformation, and that both theater and therapy can be useful tools for helping people live fuller, richer lives.
I love that you spoke on that because I was curious how therapy and the existential theories, etc., the idea of the here and now and the relationship and to others and self, how that plays into theater. How would your artists, the actors, the participants, be able to find that dance between exploring themselves, being authentic, but not internalizing a role, if you will, that may or may not apply to their life? Do they have to play someone that is fitting to who they are in real life? Is this, how do those lines not get so blurred that they now get lost in it, if you will?
That's a question that has been bedeviling actors and people who think about theater since Greek times.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
many responses have come up to that. But I guess what I'll give you answers that sort of relate to two different things. One is about the way we created work and the way that many companies do. Think about this. A normal, traditional, mainstream, whatever word you want to use, way of making theater is a playwright somewhere writes a script. And maybe they have readings and they get some feedback, but essentially there's an individual person who writes a script. It gets handed over to a producer or a director. They say, yes, we want to do this. They hire a bunch of actors. Maybe they've worked with them before, maybe they haven't. They hire designers, and then everybody comes around, and together, this group, we might call the forces of production or something, uh, interpret the script that the playwright has given them. So each actor is given a role. The actor then says, it's gonna be my task to embody this role. The director says, this is what I think things look like. And it's more or less collaborative depending upon the group. But ultimately, you're interpreting primarily. You're not creating, you're not generating in a creative sense. You are interpreting, and then you're bringing your artistry to it. And this is wonderful. And this is the work of most actors and directors and whatnot throughout time. There is an alternate stream that's been happening for thousands of years also, um, which is a pathway in which the actors, the director, the whole group is also the author of a text. And maybe they have somebody who serves as a principal writer. Maybe their work is improvisational. If you look at Commedia dell'arte in Italy, that whole tradition for hundreds of years was essentially improvisational or group created, often with a lead writer, but it's new. and it's coming from the actors. And today we have, certainly in America and in much of Europe, what is tends to be lumped under the umbrella of devised work, which is something in which the actors are, you're doing a lot of improvisational type work of various sorts, and the actors are creating work. And then either as a group, they sort of build a script out of that, or in the case of my company, what we would often do is something where we would bring in a wonderful playwright. We would do lots of what I would call maybe structured improvisational work in which a scenario is given out, actors are moving or talking, they're developing characters. The playwright is either directing a lot of that work, giving a lot of those suggestions, or gathering the material and crafting it into a script. So what I would do when we have the resources, because it's extremely inefficient financially, is do all this work together. So you got to have everybody in the room together to make something.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
ultimately, you end up with something that the team of actors and creators have helped co-create. That doesn't mean you're creating somebody who is exactly like the actor, of course, but has some of their input into it.
I see.
So,
So there's that element of authenticity that comes together with stepping into a role, if you will.
yeah, and that would take a lot of what my work in that type of work in that type of scenario would be helping the actors access things internally, ideas, feelings, emotions, family history, stories, etc.,
Okay.
and bringing that into this big thing we're creating.
Yeah, which is the work of a therapist. Would that be fair to say?
I think that there's a very close distinction there.
Very much so. Talk to me a little bit more. I'm intrigued because of your love for art and theater and your education in that field. How do you think, not how per se, do you think that the art of theater and the emotions that play, whatever they may be, that they can, in addition to what you just expressed, be part of the therapeutic act? So in addition to this, the various artists looking inward to assess their own family history, as you said, can the art of theater, I guess I should say, be a form of therapy to a degree outside of, say, your traditional therapy setting? And if so, how?
Yeah, so absolutely, and various ways of doing it. There's a whole field of drama therapy, and uh, I want to not step on people's toes, and I want to be a little cautious about this. But there are many sub schools in this field. There are about 20 major ones where the idea is that in some way you're using theatrical technique to access things, or sometimes it's look at alternative ways that, let's say you had a conflict with your boss or your mother or whatever, you can look at develop other ways of how you might interact with that person so that you get some alternate stories. A lot of it, to give credit where it's due, comes from a practice called psychodrama, which was sort of the most, the original codifying work on this. And often that would have, not only might you have a different conversation with your imagined boss or mother or whatever, you might then switch and take the other person's role and switch back and forth so that you're sort of showing us what that other person's interpretation is. Now, I'll jump ahead without trying to list all of these different practices and tell you what I'm focusing on. Um, so my work in the theater had a lot to do with working with the body and how do we tell stories with our body. Lots of reasons for that. One is we in America in particular are really, really good in terms of our acting style of doing the other thing. You learn words, you think psychologically, and you develop a character. This is method acting, everything coming down from a certain period of Stanislavski's thought, Russian theorist. We're really good at that. It's great for doing film, things that are sort of face up. We are not historically very good at doing work that comes from the body. So I spent a lot of time, what I wanted in my actors, what I still want, hopefully, if I get back into directing again, is somebody to have the capacity to do both, go back and forth, develop characters either way. What that meant for me as a director in a environment where people were really good at working with their thoughts and their voices was learning a whole lot about how to work from the body. The reason it's important for therapy, and what I'm doing my current research on, is a big problem with talk therapy. Most of what we think of when we think of psychotherapy, two people sitting and talking together. A huge problem is that there's so much talk.
Yeah.
We're limited to speaking.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, that's true.
and I mean, we have some like somatic experiencing is certainly starting to work through the body, and there are many forms of creative, expressive arts therapy. Um, much of, not all, but much of the drama therapy that's out there tends to also be, in a different way, very talky. You're improvising what you're going to say if you had this scenario where you're talking to your mother or your boss.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of the dialogue, if you will, working it out through dialogue or monologue, I
Exactly.
suppose. Okay.
Exactly.
I'm following.
Yeah. And so a lot of the work that I did with my company for many years was how do you tell stories that come from your body or that come from how, trying to understand an emotion that's happening. And then if there is language, it's often more poetic or metaphorical, say, than discursive. Then I'm going to sit here and, through exposition, tell you what I'm thinking or how my week went or what my problem with my boss or my mother is. Um, and that's great for those of us who have great facility translating our experience into discursive language. It's not true for everybody. And it's not, even if it is true for some people, there are other things they might access if we give them another method. So, what I am trying to do currently, my research is on I work a lot in narrative therapy, um, and that helps people, as many do, but it helps people come up with different concepts of self. And so, what I might be doing is putting some words in, or feeling and understanding of who you tell me you were and what your values are and who you want to be or what this new vision of yourself, like I might trace a value that somebody expresses and look at the thread of that in their life, even if that wasn't what they were conscious of. That might help them, what we would call reauthor an aspect of their life. Yeah. I can take that idea, that new sense of self or that sense of one's behavior as having had a certain um, ethic behind it, and then I can put them into some of the types of theater, body-based theater exercises that I might have worked in. And that might develop a phrase or two that may not be explanatory, but just like I might have them move around on the floor in the room, lie on the floor, get a feeling, and then get up and write without thinking about it. And from that writing, that might happen for a minute or two, we might pull a couple of phrases, which tend to be kind of poetic and metaphorical. And then they've got I mean, it's not a mantra, but it may be some way equivalent. How are you going to use this phrase? And maybe we'll make some dance or something around it, a movement sequence that goes with that phrase. And then they've got something in their body, a felt sense of experience of this transformation from before to now.
I love that. This is a new concept and angle of therapy that I'm not well versed in, and I find that very intriguing because it sounds to me like it gives the recipient of this experience something tangible. And
Yeah.
I do understand that that often is more profound, just like with children and their various styles of learning. A lot of us, we need something hands on. Give me more than just a memorization, if you will. So to
Yeah.
me, that sounds very effective, very powerful.
We're seeing. I'm working with it now. It's a new direction, but it's rooted in many years of experience in the theater work, and exactly why I'm hoping it will be as effective as it will is this sense of giving people a really much deeper experience, and for some people this will probably not be all that. It may not work for them in a deep way, but I think for some it really will.
Do you think that there's you already just said it might not work for everyone, but do you think there's limitations in regards to what type of disorder the client or the patient is dealing with? Is this better for your, everyday person who's just trying to redefine who they are, struggling with relational matters, maybe some anxiety, some depression, but not necessarily severe pathologies? Or do you think this model could be effective across the board if it fits the patient's personality?
I'm not sure yet. I think it can be, but I would also note, since we're just starting our conversation here, that my I'm very skeptical as a therapist of labels, of pathology, of disorder, of syndrome. I mean, it's not to say these things don't exist, but it's not where I tend to want to do my work with my patients.
I like that. I appreciate you saying that. I actually am trying to move away from that as well in my journey, and I'm not as far down the road as you are yet. But actually, reading a lot of your father's work had added to that, to learning much more about the patient therapist relationship and the authenticity and that here and now, which is something I'm still trying to understand.
And his work in the here and now is a very particular approach, but I think some of the larger lessons there, that a lot of what happens is what happens between us, is important. But and now maybe we're getting into this sort of younger generation, social media, all of that. One of the things that my father says often, I think it's written very clearly in his book, Gift of Therapy, is never diagnose. And then he has in parentheses, it's unless it's for insurance companies.
Yeah. Yes. I love the authenticity about that, by the way. I appreciate anyone in that field who was honest about,
Yeah.
I'm going to say it, the corruption on that side of things
Yeah.
and the need to,
Yeah.
work
But
around that.
here's what happens. And this is what my father would say, the narrative therapy, which is the approach I'm learning to sort of marry to my father's approaches, would say, look, the moment you give a label to a patient, the moment you say you have major depressive disorder, or here's one that we often get, she's got borderline personality disorder. And we say that, I say she, because it's almost always women, and which tells us something about, is this valid?
Yeah.
Question as to whether this is a valid diagnosis or not. But
Or is it just that we're women?
yeah, or is it just that a lot of men came up with these labels and
Ooh.
I don't
Oh.
know.
Oh, I appreciate the authenticity of that. Yes. Okay.
But here's the thing: once you label somebody like that, it shuts down the way you see them as a therapist. Probably the kinds of questions that you're asking yourself as a therapist. It goes from people go from being a full person who you want to learn about, who's unique and has their particular experience, to being a label. Oh, you have major depressive disorder. That I mean, come on, look at it. Also, the DSM. How do we know somebody has major depressive disorder? Well, they give you a list, I believe it is, of 9 traits or symptoms they might exhibit, and they have to have, in the last 2 weeks, I think it's 2 weeks for major depressive, it might be longer, they have to have exhibited 5 of them. Oh, so I go through this. Here's clinicians that I go through. I look at the list. I look at 5 of these categories, or look at all 9. I say, oh yeah, I think we could call that. They did this thing. It's a little bit like that. They're not sleeping well. They have no, they're not taking pleasure in things. Great, they're major depressive disorder. And then we stop. For most of us, you stop asking so many questions about the person, about their experience in life, about what might have caused, like maybe they have a really abusive boss at work, or their relationship is falling apart. Okay, but we don't really ask those questions as much in general. You start to say, well, we need to put you on SSRIs, or we're going to go through this. But regardless of what the outcome of what the prescription is, or the whatever the strategy is going to be, it's that they get narrowed down from being a person, a full person, to being category. So
I 100% agree. And to take that a step further, I feel like it also then affects those who are training to be therapists. If now it becomes this assessment of all the things you should know, and maybe this is just a theory, could it be that there's so many more healers just to keep it general, out there who actually
Yeah.
would be really good at relationship and thus
Hmm.
bringing what therapy was meant to be originally versus not passing the test because they could not, they felt maybe overwhelmed or intimidated by, you know, understanding the DSM-5 and now they feel disqualified versus
Yep.
understanding what most humans really need.
Absolutely. I agree completely. And there's one other aspect to it, which is that I don't know if this is good or bad, but when I was younger, let's go back 30 years, people, I started to experience some depression myself. Now, I grew up in a family of therapists and I was kind of okay talking about it, but many people at the time would not want to say, I have bipolar disorder or I have major depressive disorder. And I don't think it was good that there was a stigma attached often. That's a terrible thing. We've come a long way from that. At the same time, what we often have now, what I see in my office is, and I think social media is a major player here, um, because people talk so much about their mental health on TikTok or what have you. People now come in to my office saying, yeah, I have major depressive disorder and I have OCD and this and this and this. And there's a there's a quality of almost like happiness to flaunt one's diagnoses, but at the same time, I think it tends to steal agency from people. If they walk in and they say, I've got this problem, fix me. Or sometimes underlying that is, I have this problem, I don't have agency in the choices I want to make in the world. And therefore, I'm a victim to what happens to me.
Yeah, yeah, because if it's something that's wrong with you, possibly, or something, a chemical
Mhm.
imbalance in the brain, or something that's out of our control, right? So now we're already looking at the world through that lens and limited in regards to what may be effective as a remedy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I like how you said that, especially when you brought in the world of TikTok and self-diagnosis. I see it greatly in the field of when it comes to the topic of narcissism. Yeah, I feel like
Mhm.
that had been it was a trending topic for a while in the sense of people finding these little checklists of how to tell if their spouse, best friend, or whoever was a narcissist or just toxic in general. And I
Yeah,
think that affects.
toxic one. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, yeah, the toxic. Remove yourself from the toxic. Do you think that just to tie it back into the theater again, where we see a lot of roles being played, and
Mhm.
now these generalizations and what you just expressed, people self-diagnosing. Do you think that this digital age has created new sets of roles for us, the way that maybe we would find in theater? You just mentioning one, that being a person coming in self-diagnosing, being their own therapist.
Well, this is so that maybe takes us out of the specifically the therapy world a little bit. But when I think about what people do in order to build a following, say on any of YouTube or TikTok or whatever, um, well, this has a little bit to do with some of the thinking that I'm doing that I'm hoping to put in my new book. Is the idea of a media influencer or of a social media influencer. If you are somebody, and I'm just thinking this out, so this is this week's thought. Um, if you are somebody who is really interested in exploring something or just excited about different things in the world, or you have a particular topic like you do, looking at music and psychology and reaction videos and how those develop identity and group, um, this is great, right? Social media has made it possible for people to reach an audience where they have what, in your little town might not, there might be six people who are interested. No, it's not great. But worldwide, you know, hundreds of thousands. So that's wonderful. But I think there's a lot of, I see this with my children, who follow a lot of social media influencers, and the idea of, I just want to be a YouTuber, say, I want to be an influencer. So then what you are doing is making videos or stuff in order to be interesting, in order to appear interesting, as opposed to, I'm interested. and I'm
Yes,
sharing
I'm
it.
creating this or sharing it. Okay, okay, I'm following.
So I do think there's some challenge because we know pretty well from psychological research that people are, if they are interested in the world, if they are, people call it novelty seeking behavior, if they're high on that score, or they're interested in communicating with others and finding out about how others are doing, this tends to lead to much happier life, better mental health. If they are always focused on themselves and trying to gauge in some way, constantly getting their self-worth from how other people are responding to them. Am I getting praised? Am I getting a maximum number of likes, etc.? This tends to have the opposite effect and make people less content. So I think there's something there. I don't know how well I can articulate it yet. When you say, is there a role that people are playing? I think that for those who are playing a role, I'm going to be an influencer, I'm going to be a YouTuber. If the goal behind that again is because you're interested and you want to share things, wonderful. You have an incredible tool, unlike the world has never seen, like the world has never seen. If you are doing it in order to try and find your validation for yourself by how many people press like or subscribe, then you're less likely to feel good and to do that. So yes, that's a long-winded answer to your.
No, it makes a lot of sense. I guess then it becomes that dopamine chase or whatever they want to call it. Because now I don't feel like I'm fitting my role. I'm not the influencer. I'm not a successful YouTuber unless I get the likes
Yep.
or good comments for that matter, right? Negative hater comments and trolls aside. That makes a lot of sense. I could see that influencing how people present themselves, but also how they're received.
Mhm.
And I mean, obviously, I know that's even a case in therapy because when you have a therapist, I mean, even someone like yourself, full disclosure, it's hard for me to not be aware of who you are and have this great admiration for your expertise and your background. And then in addition to the lineage you come from, and there's all this potential of transference, obviously.
So,
And that affects how I may or may not listen to you, right? I may esteem your words higher than if a person on the street wants to just talk to me about therapy or theater or whatnot.
right.
Would you say it's possible that those kinds of things happen in the same sense that there's this, I think there's a word for it I can't think of right now, when there's a level of imbalance of power? Say if I were to say something and I'm trying to be therapeutic, I'm genuinely trying to help people listening, but they already have me somewhere, they placed me somewhere, and they might now hear what I'm saying through a different lens. Is that
Yeah, and you're,
possible?
yeah, well, yes, absolutely. I mean, you have a degree of authority and status in the room. Now, different clients are going to consider that differently, but there's sort of an inherent initial imbalance in that people are coming to see you for help, and you are, to whatever degree we might feel this way, we are going to be seen as experts. Somebody comes in the room. So we need to be really aware of this as therapists. It would be great if our clients are aware of this too, that most of us are just human beings. Um, there might be some who are something else. I don't
Yeah.
know. It's always
I'm an
possible.
alien, but no, I'm just
Right,
kidding.
right. Superhero or
Yeah.
a
I
dog
wish,
in our
right?
lap. But most of us still struggle with our own things, and hopefully, because this is our world that we're working in, we've done a lot of individual work sort of figuring some things out. But none of us have, if you were my client, I don't have the answer for you. I can't just give it to you. I can try and help you find things that work for you. It's interesting though, for me to make my entrance into the therapy world very much on the coattails of my father, or maybe even climbing up the back of his coat as we've written this book together. Uh, that there is both in the stories that I hear from him, and it comes up in the book in several of the stories, sort of how his very elevated status impacts some of his clients. And even for me, I have some clients who over the last couple of years have been like, well, God, I just have to say, I feel this, I hold you in very high regard. Um, and that can be a little problematic. The other the other thing though is if you can be aware and use it well, it can be very useful. not that I want my patients to see me as being in a different category, but I do want my words to have weight. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. That's where I see those parallels between, even though I understand the two very different worlds, between therapy and possibly the therapeutic elements that we can find on social media. Now, obviously, we both know therapeutic elements, things that feel therapeutic, are very different than actual therapy. But, I think sometimes people see those things and they find comfort. My concern is that sometimes they don't take it further. I find that with my audience as well, where I hope to say something encouraging, but it's still not meant to be in lieu of therapy. And that's the tricky part, is you can't tell the
Yeah.
individual to go seek therapy. I mean, you can, but it's up to them to now
If they
take the
like it.
action.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, I mean, I think that another interesting parallel that you just brought up is, even outside of the world of therapy, a a good or popular social media influencer carries a lot of weight for their audience. And one hopes that the messages they send are good messages. But if they are, then they can do a lot of good in the world. And I know when you originally contacted me, I said, look, I have a lot of ambivalence about these things. But I say that in really in the honest sense of the word, ambivalence. Some things are very positive, some things are negative. So I think that influencers and social media can do a lot of amazing things, and some not so good.
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. That's why I appreciate your honest conversations about it, because neither extreme of it's all horrible or it's all wonderful would seem realistic. But I like the approach because it is encouraging. It is encouraging for me to hear that and to be reminded. I'd like to go just a little bit deeper as we continue speaking of therapy and those things, and the digital age and the power of
Yeah,
influencers.
yeah.
When you think of therapy today, especially in this digital age, do you think that something is lost when we are when we're accessing it through a different medium, through a different stage? Just your
So
opinion through the screen versus.
like if I'm doing therapy,
Yes,
Zoom. Okay.
through Zoom, or I'm not sure if there's ever what that would probably be a segue of your thoughts on text therapy and those kinds of approaches. But
Yeah,
just for what we're experiencing even here in real time, our conversation through the screen,
sure.
do you feel that that affects our interaction?
Mhm. Um, yes, but surprisingly less in certain circumstances, certain contexts, less than I imagined it would when I started work in the field. So what I mean by that is, I'll be a little personal, and then you'll see if we need to retake anything to edit it out. Um, so I began my work in the theater years ago. One of the main impetuses, I don't know if that's a plural or not. One of the main reasons I began working in the theater was I looked at the world, which was still very much, we weren't all on computers all day long, way back in the dark ages. And I thought, wow, most of the jobs I see that are out there are going to end up spending all day in front of their computer. And I was really interested in what makes theater different. What is going to lead to successful theater or a successful role for theater in our society has to be about the things that happen live, right? Otherwise, we're just watching Netflix. It's why not? It's better at making a movie. It's if we're just talking about telling a story in visual terms, TV is easier, better, streaming, whatever. So the work in the my choice to work in the theater was because I didn't want to sit in front of a computer all day, and I wanted to create experiences where people could be in the same space and experience something that felt communal, ritualistic in some ways. So this is a little bit of a side, backstory here. So edit as you see fit. When I began thinking about going into therapy, part of my hope was that it would be a lot of in-person interactions with people. COVID happened or was happening when I started. Not that people weren't seeing each other on Zoom prior to that, but COVID vastly accelerated that, such that most therapists now see most or the majority of their clients online. My assumption was it's going to be a very impoverished therapy experience because we're not in the room together. Um, what I have found is that this isn't entirely true. I think that particularly doing individual therapy, the experience is pretty similar. Um, I mean, it's qualitatively different in some ways. We don't get to have the same experience, but I think for most of what we do in terms of speaking with one another and the talk therapy aspects of it, I don't know if it's 90% or 95% of the experience or 80%, but I think it does a pretty good job. There's a certain intimacy that's created in the screen between us. It's of a different nature, but it's still pretty intimate. Um, so I've been really pleasantly surprised in that particular context, individual therapy through Zoom. And the counterbalance is it's so much more convenient for people, right? You don't have to take 3 hours out of your day to go do a 1 hour therapy session. And that's great for some people, but for most of us with busy lives and money stress and children and what have you, or I have to have children to be busy in this culture. Um, it's great, and you can see therapists, in theory, within your own state. That's going to hopefully change at some point because it's a archaic rule. Um, but so I've actually found it to be not bad. Now, with couples, because I work a lot with couples, I think there's a little bit more of a challenge. Um, I, it's still probably better than I thought it would be, but there is something. I don't like to work with couples when they're in two different places, but if they're in the same room, um, then it's not bad because you really want to be able to see. You want the two of them to be able to interact. Now I miss out on a lot of body language from me being here and you being there, and uh, particularly with couples, I think that body language is really important to pick up on. And with groups, it gets again, more challenging. I think there's so much going on, and when you're just looking at a bunch of boxes, I don't, again, it may be better, it's probably better in lots of contexts than people not doing therapy because it's too inconvenient, but I don't love it. Um, and then all of the work that, we were talking about earlier, the work that I'm trying to do with bringing the body focus in the theater. And again, you can kind of do that on screen, but it's much less. It's much so. So those are some feelings. Text therapy, I'm not a huge fan of. That kind of goes into a whole different direction. But the Zoom is the telehealth or whatever you want to call it. It's not bad. It's
Would would the criteria then, I guess, be, since you're differentiating between video and telehealth versus text therapy, which I completely understand from my own perspective, by the way, and because there is that screen, they're still seeing one another, versus with text, there's no element of visualization, body language, nothing.
there's nothing, and I don't want to put too extreme an idea on it, but there are a couple of things that happen or can happen with text. And I don't know, I haven't done a lot of it. I'm not, these are maybe thoughts or fears more than, um, coming from experience. Really hard, I think, to get to a place of authenticity, intimacy, challenge for people in text. Also because things like email and text are so notoriously difficult to judge tone of what somebody's saying that I could, you write a sentence or two and I totally misinterpret what you're trying to say with that. I read something in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that happens in real life, but it's a whole lot easier. Like we got a whole lot more information.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if it happens between friends or family members who are already, the emotion and the conflict comes in, how much more in a therapy session where you don't necessarily know the patient doesn't know the therapist, how much is their safety to really communicate. Also, I think, and this is, and you can share if you agree or not. This it makes me think that it becomes more of a therapeutic word versus actual therapy or the therapeutic act. Meaning, someone can say something nice and it might make me feel better for a few minutes, but is it actually really therapy? Is it really the relationship and that interaction of working through things that are affecting my entire life?
Yeah, yeah. This is related to that. I am not a huge fan of sort of therapy as validation as a thing. I mean, therapy for certain people, you need to do some validation, sure. But there's something about, and this goes back to sort of the self-diagnosis and the TikTok and all of that, this idea that people want to go to therapy once a week to get validated and told, no, you're doing great. Um, that's nice, but it doesn't actually
I like
doesn't
how you
actually
worded that.
you don't actually confront usually the real stuff and make
Yeah.
change. Therapy is about ideally good therapy is about making change in the person that you're working with, helping them make change. Sort of giving them a pat on the back and saying, "Hey, it's not your fault. You're really cool,"
Yeah.
is
It's
is a
not your
bit
fault.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, I don't think
And
that it can evoke long-term change, and
right,
shouldn't
right.
that be the goal of therapy? I mean, yeah, what's
And
the
then
point of it
and
all?
so I think text on a phone where you're walking along and you're like, I'm not, here's the example of it is I'm like, God, I'm feeling kind of nervous right now. I'm just going to text my therapist for a minute. I'm going to send back some like thumbs up. And I'm like, great, okay,
Yeah.
okay, on. 5 minutes later, send them,
Yeah. Yeah. It's a constant quick fix, which would fit to what social media I think is doing for a lot of people, including the next generation that is growing up with it. But even those of us who, were born pre-digital age or on the cusp of it, it fits, it's goes with this. I like calling it that swulture, the swipe culture,
yeah,
of just, just going through it, and our attention span is getting shorter, and now I need you to entertain me for 30 seconds, now it's 3, and now if you didn't catch me in the first 2, I'm swiping away. And
yep,
I think that type of approach to therapy would imply a similar consumeristic approach, if you will, of,
yeah,
tell me something good, I'm gonna keep moving. It's a little drug, if you will.
yeah. And that's, right into what you said earlier about the dopamine hit, which it could be therapy or it could be, 20 minutes on your video game or whatever. Um, and there is a place, perhaps, for a lot of therapy that does a lot of validation and helps people get through the day if that's what they need. It's not the therapy that I'm interested in practicing.
I I can see that, and I think not I think I know I can appreciate that, uh, because I think that there are a lot of hurting people who, as much as they might like the feeling of the validation, need healing for wounds that are much deeper
Yeah.
than make me feel okay for 5 minutes.
Yeah. And also, I think that one of the ways that those wounds come up, um, in the manifest, is in difficulty with interpersonal relationships. Hard for me to get close to you, um, because if we get close, I need to open up and show you parts of myself that I might not be very comfortable with, ashamed of, triggered by. Um, but if I can't do that with you, then the opportunity to have closeness with you in my life goes away. And I end up feeling more isolated and more alone in trying to understand how to live my life. And I don't think that the sort of text slash quick hit validation version of therapy can be helpful in that aspect of opening vulnerability, the relationship between us for that reason. That's very much where my father's work lies and what this last book is about. But I do find it even, I'm practicing, as I say, a somewhat different approach or aspects of it, but in a very different population. But still, many of the people who come in to see me on some level, maybe it's not the surface, but on some level under there, what they're trying to do or what they're struggling with is how to connect good way, in an authentic way, to other people in the world.
That is so true. Do you think that it affects therapists and how they show up to that therapy session in light of the digital age? So we spoke on how it affects the patients and not looking for a quick fix. How do you think that it may or may not affect the therapist who is doing things through the screen, if you will?
I think I'm following you, but just to be clear, when you say, how do I think it affects it? What's the it?
It is the thank you for clarifying that. Let me be more specific. Not only the digital age, but the influences of social media, but particularly video
Mm.
telehealth, video therapy, the
Well,
screen.
I mean, there's something that's mediated, and I, particularly being all these years in the theater, I very much appreciate human beings together, being together in the same space. But you know, as with everybody else in the world, I'm having to adapt to this being an honest and intimate encounter, and I do think it takes a little more verbal openness and explanation. Like, um, oh, let's see, how can I put it? You kind of have to over communicate a little bit in comparison with what you might have done before, where your body language might have done some of the work for you. Um, Slowing down is helpful here, as it is in therapy in general. Not my not my greatest skill. I tend to
Me
want to know
too.
lots of questions. Um, okay. Okay, as long as they're, you know, they're useful and you're not running over all the time for introspection. Um, there is also the sense of um, I said earlier that there is some appeal to me in going into the field in, you know, having real IRL contact with people, and that's an adjustment to think that this contact, this communication that I'm having with you right now, you know, I'm getting used to your face, I'm getting used to the way that you interact, but that this is as much contact as I'm going to have with you. Not necessarily emotionally or intellectually, we're continuing to build that, but that this somehow um, replaces what it might be like if you and I were in the same room, how we might experience each other differently. Uh, and I think probably similar to patients. For some people, this is a great benefit. It's a lot to go from being in the room with you and having this experience to 10 minutes later at the end of the hour being with somebody else. And maybe this helps me have a little bit more space to that the emotional transference or whatever the emotional experience that I have if I am open with you. I need I need a few minutes at the end of the session to like put myself in a space where I'm available for the next person, and maybe it's a little bit easier. I don't
That
know.
makes sense in the sense of, for the where the therapist can now also have a minute. The Zoom call ends and one can now breathe, process,
Yeah,
put that in
I,
its drawer for the next
yeah.
session. Okay.
And you need, I mean, I think you need that live or on Zoom, but it may be that it's a little bit easier that when you actually click the off button, you know, if the door is shut, everything is off, and you.
Yeah. I agree. Now, just to go a little further on the telehealth, there are certain programs that I will not name, but you may or may not be familiar with, that are marketing themselves from the angle of not only making mental health and therapy accessible to a large group of people through telehealth, but they're also marketing it from the angle of, you can keep looking until you find the right fit for you, right? There's that freedom to go, unlimited, change your therapist, will match you with someone, maybe answer a little questionnaire. And now, if that's not a fit for you, change it as often as you wish. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that approach?
Well, again, ambivalent. Um, when I encounter a new client or a new potential client, I always tell them it's very important for them to find a therapist who feels right to them, where they feel there's a fit. Absolutely. We know that the therapeutic alliance, as we call it, which is just the relationship between the client and the therapist, is hugely important in terms of, is the therapy going to be helpful? So I always encourage potential new clients to look around, talk to a couple of other people. Um, and it's also important to, if you're in the process of therapy with somebody and they say, hey, I just don't think this is working. As a therapist, I can like get super offended and be like, oh my God, what did I do wrong? Okay, why, if we're trying to have an intimate relationship here, why would one person fit all? It just doesn't make any sense. So, uh, in that aspect of it, we as therapists need to be okay saying, hey, I get that. I can help you find somebody else. I can make some referrals, or go and be well. Um, and I'm here if you need to get back to me. Great. Um, that said, sort of a Tinder approach, uh, swipe, 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 I don't think is, I think there's lots of ways where that could be not helpful for clients. Um, if you have to take the time to see if this is a person who you might connect with. And I'm just going to move on to the next person because I felt a little discomfort today. Therapy is not supposed to be comfortable. It really is. I mean, it's not aggressive, hopefully, and it's not my job to make you feel uncomfortable. But if we actually dig into something where is a problem for you in the most gentle, caring way, it's still going to be uncomfortable.
Of course. I mean, literally, if we're of uncovering wounds, even just in the physical sense, that hurts. Who's to say it won't hurt if it's just a mental wound?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And so if we get too much encouragement to be like, well, if this one's not feeling good, let's find another one, that seems like a recipe for real problems to me. So the sort of the ease of finding the initial person, okay, but at some point you kind of have to make a choice and say, I'm going to go into this for a while, knowing that at some point it's going to be uncomfortable, and we need to have the time to have a growth experience.
That makes sense. I suppose if the shopping for a therapist, for lack of a better word, becomes a consumer situation, and now I'm only here to consume from the therapist, is it possible then that may be a reflection of some of the relational issues outside of therapy, but there can be no growth now because I'm just shopping around and you're not here long enough to deal with that or to address that in me.
Yeah, and I mean, this is analogous in some way, but listen to this and then imagine if you amplified it by the just swipe right uh, attitude. I have some clients I have worked with where after 3 or 4 or 5 sessions, we're starting to really get into something that is not what they said they came for initially, usually, or maybe it is, but it's starting to get uncomfortable a bit because we're actually digging into something. So by way of example, I had a client last year who came in and said that they were a compulsive liar. We went back, found lots of stories of their youth where I can completely understand, horrible, traumatic, abusive childhood, um, developing a habit of lying a lot to cover for themselves and their family of origin. Um, but then at a certain point, we start really getting into what's going on here. How does it impact your daily life now? Are you lying to me in the session? Because how do I know?
Yeah. That's the dilemma.
Yeah, and so really, in a way, putting this person on the spot, and their first response is, yes, this is what we need to do. This is helpful. The next session, yeah, this is helpful, but oh, it's uncomfortable. The session after that, deflection. I'm going to tell you about something else that happened, and I listen for, well, really, this is deflection, and then gone. Um, I need to stop now for a little bit and I'll get back to you, and they never do. And part of the issue there is, well, we're touching on some serious things. This has happened several times. It seems normal. I'm sure most therapists who are willing to go into the dark spots have this happen to them. But imagine if this were amplified by, all it takes to switch is just like, whoop,
Wow.
someone
Yes,
else
yes,
can see.
yes. Yeah, yeah. No real change could really happen. No healing, not even just change. I'm tempted to say change because, and this is me being personal, there's a part of me that goes, "Oh, I wonder what all would come up in me or what will still come up in my journey and how much of what it shows about my flaws and mistakes instead of realizing is change is a fitting word, but maybe more so even healing, coming back to it from the empathy standpoint of it brings things up in us when we go to therapy, but it's not necessarily meant for not at all meant for shame and oh my goodness, let's talk about how bad you really are, but healing. Like let's bring
Yeah.
that up, and that is uncomfortable. It's painful. It's very painful.
So just to bring it back to the digital aspect, I think that if you are in a place where you're a digital native, you know, Gen whatever Gen you are, then maybe it's okay that you're used to sort of having everything mediated through your phone. And that may feel more real for, my daughter than it feels for me in some way. It probably does. But if that turns into, TikTok swipe or, swipe right, swipe left, um, then the attention span, the capacity for discomfort, uh, that that one hopes one can go through in therapy with a supportive yet challenging therapist, is the possibility for that lessened significantly.
Could it also affect people's trust? You spoke on the willingness to work on the deep wounds, the dark wounds. You spoke on the attention span. Could it also, or can social media affect how we are willing to trust, to have
Hmm.
that intimate connection?
I can think of several things that come to mind, but tell me a little bit more about like who's trusting whom in
Good
this
question.
subjective moment.
Great question. I think of social media and I think of how quick people are to comment, and how there's this false sense of safety, right? People are keyboard warriors, we call them, where they say things they wouldn't dare to say in person, most at least, or where you have people that are desperately longing for someone to agree with them, to, validate, then you have the algorithm pushing whatever bias confirmation you already are looking for, right? You looked at one video, now you get 10 more of the same. And it creates this, in my mind, this isolation where now it's hard to know, can I really trust this person that says they liked what I said? Or am I safe to open myself up and tell people how this affects me? Because I'm protected by the screen. I can delete. So there's this, does that world affect both the patient trusting the therapist? Is the therapist safe for me? But also vice versa. Can the therapist can navigate through those waters of authentic, intimate relationship?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a I think a critical question, not only in the therapy relationship, but for people interacting in the world. Uh, Well, I think there's a real potential problem with it, and it's not just that as a person on the other side of the screen, am I going to trust that therapist? I don't know. I can easily just get rid of them, but it's your capacity to trust anybody. It's your capacity, and it is maybe not just can I trust you, but knowing that these things, as you say, are temporary, although it's also debatable in terms of how can we go back and find these things? Does delete actually delete?
Yeah, yeah. That's another aspect.
Right. But in a way, the things that one says then have less weight to them. And I can imagine that if I'm used to my interactions with other people being on the comments on my YouTube video or in the Discord chat on the game we're playing, sorry, most of my thinking is around an 11-year-old kid, but
Yeah, no, it's fitting. It's perfect. Those are perfect examples.
yeah,
Exactly.
then when I am confronted with the situation of being in conversation with a therapist live or, through Zoom, um, the type of weighting that I'm going to give to my words and perhaps to their words may be similar, which I think is in some ways less, I might consider my words less carefully than a person who's used to having real in-person interactions where they can see the consequences of their words live and they can get due consideration from the other about what they just said and be both considered, respected, admired, if you will, but also held responsible for their words.
Yeah. And I would like to take it just a little deeper. Let's say, for example, in a therapy session with someone who understands the need for uh, the therapeutic act, an intimate therapist patient relationship. Let's say you are working on that with the patient and trust is being built. You have someone who came in skeptical, isolated, alone, whatever they're dealing with. They're now building said trust and they're learning on a micro level how to heal those wounds and become better, grow, etc. Ideally, to now take that into their everyday relationships. But they're now going back into the digital world where now we're back to people criticizing, texting one another, not experiencing a lot of in person, right? They say that we become more social but lonelier, if you will. What happens then if you do have good therapy through Zoom or in person, and you have now healing happening through that relationship with the therapist, but now we're having a generation having a hard time translating that on a macro level in their relationships in the real world because the rest of the world is still swiping and is
Yeah.
still on social media.
No, it's a fascinating question, actually. You really got into the heart of something there. My hope would be, for all of us to be able to grow, become more confident in ourselves, be more aware of the impacts of our words on others. And by confident, I don't just mean like self-confident, but between the combination of awareness and confidence does this, and I think, maybe a new idea here. If I am aware of the impact of my words on others, I may choose them more carefully. If I am confident enough in myself, somebody says something mean to me, controls, and whatever,
Right.
I don't have to lash out with a response.
I like that.
I don't have to, and that may be the tenor of the particular Discord channel that we're on, or whatever. But you don't have to do it. Uh, you can choose to respond differently or not to respond at all. And so that combination of awareness and some confidence in self, or maybe liking oneself um, more than many of us do, or have had to work through, um, and not seeking validation constantly, or sense of self constantly through reflection of what other people say to you, you're probably going to do a little better in terms of your contentedness in your life. Certainly with close friends and partners, but most of these interactions that we're talking about are not with close friends or partners. Um, I am so again, there my ambivalence about social media in general, as you say, there's a whole lot more chat going on, and often a lot more loneliness. Uh, And it's not that I don't think one can have meaningful relationships that way, but the tools of having meaningful relationships with somebody you can be more authentic with are more important in leading a contented life and a helpful life.
I love that response. Since we're speaking, Ben, on therapy in a digital age, now looking at the rise of AI and how AI, artificial intelligence, is learning to imitate empathy, which we can find when you put in a question into GPT or those places. What do you think sets a human therapist apart?
Yeah. So yes, this is a critical question. And the answer right now is going to be very different from the answer in 5 years. I think. I'm not sure. And it also just, for me, it takes me all the way back to the theater world where all this time I spent thinking about what is live, what's unique to being live, and that's changing too. Is it live if we have an event where everybody's watching on Zoom? Uh, or so then we have time synchronicity, just being in the same place. Um, but okay, that's not what you asked. What,
No, but I love how you just tied that back into that because there are parallels indeed.
so a couple of main thoughts come up. One has to do with what is the client looking for in the therapy, or what is the purpose of this particular therapy. Um, I can imagine, from what little I've seen of AI therapy at this point, that for certain types of problems and certain modalities, it's probably really good and almost as good as a human therapist. If I'm trying to stop smoking and I'm going through some course of, some CBT or something, okay, that's fine. Probably if the patient is somebody who has the capacity to take in things digitally, completely digitally, and that feels okay to them, and they actually can attune and listen and respond, they may get a lot of benefit out of that. I'm using CBT again, but I had a patient who had an app that they put a lot of their information into and got constant reminders or responses based on sort of very manualized CBT algorithm, and it was helpful for them. Uh, that said, what is the journey that we as individuals are on when we're looking for meaning, when we're looking into sort of deeper understanding of ourselves? Um, I think there are limitations there at this point. I do think it's going to keep getting better and that people are going to build relationships with their AI friends, and AI therapists. Um, I think conceptually, hypothetically, philosophically, somewhere in there, if the position of the therapist is, as my father likes to say, one of being a fellow traveler in the world, then it's going to be very hard for us to honestly believe on some level that an AI algorithm is in fact someone who has shared the experience of being alive and being human and suffering the problems, the emotions of, say, grief, as well as the elation of wonderful things. So I do think that there's some qualitative difference there, but I'm also pretty, I haven't made a prejudgment on AI to the extent that many have. I think it really is fascinating to see what's going to happen. Uh, and then if, does that mean that you have an avatar or a deep fake or whatever, a
Mm-hmm.
perfectly realistic human looking interlocutor who is speaking what the AI comes up with at some point? I don't know. I really don't.
Yeah, that scares me though. I agree. There's a lot of there benefits there, and from a CBT standpoint, there are benefits. I could see that, but I love how you brought it back to the idea of being fellow travelers.
Hmm.
And there's no possible way that a computer can, even if they look realistic, in my mind, of course. To your point, we don't know how things will be in 5 years, but I, I think, and I'd like to hear what you think about that. At the root of a lot of our ailment is the need for human connection.
Yeah.
Not that it can fix everything, of course, but I think a lot of our wounds come from relationship and can be
Mhm.
healed through relationship,
Yeah.
at the root, and of course,
I
someone can
agree.
tell me something nice. Again, like we said earlier, that quick fix, if an AI therapist might come up with something and even say something about my mother and father that's profound, wonderful. But, the kindness and the empathy of someone who I know also knows what it's like to have a mother and father and may or may not have wounds there or healing there is different in my mind.
I think so. Um, but I'm cautious to like say that it will always be that way.
Of course.
Um,
Well, I
and,
mean, yeah.
I mean, I think part of that also is going to be about, this is where it gets really weird. Um, it's going to be just as much about the client as it is about the AI or who who is presenting their version of this, because I don't know how long it is. Let's say 50 years from now. The experience of some people may be that they interact with AIs just as much or more than they do with other human beings. And their experience of what it is to be alive in the world may be just as wrapped up with the realities of AI, robot, whatever you have, as it is with being with other humans. And that's sort of a different view of humanity, but it might
It is
become it.
very different. I see what you're saying, though, almost as if, just a hypothetical scenario pictured here, the patient saying something, or the therapist, the AI therapist, asking
Yeah.
something about how do you feel about this conversation we're having today, or this moment here, and the patient goes, well, I don't think you can relate because you have no mother, and now AI goes, well, actually, ChatGPT model 2.0 was my father,
Yeah.
and I was raised by humans, and I know what it's like to be betrayed. And, I feel, I mean, God only knows, but it's still so hard but that's because I'm not there yet. To your point, we don't know
Yeah.
how it would
We
develop.
don't know. And I'm trying to keep an open mind around it. I mean, just in the same way that uh, this is sort of, I think, quantitatively different, but not necessarily qualitatively different, is like if you have a kid who's wants a piece of information
Mm-hmm.
and their mode of getting information may be not, I'm going to ask my mom or I'm going to ask a teacher.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like so much easier. I'm just going to ask Siri. Siri hasn't become a person to them yet, but it may have become the primary, how do I get information,
Yes,
right?
that's true. If that's
And
what they grow up with.
yeah, and that seems really weird to me, but it doesn't seem weird at all to them. And the next generation, who knows what's going to seem weird to them or familiar or not.
That is very valid. It's scary it's scary to me for existential
Yeah.
standpoint, obviously, Talk about death anxieties, right? And
Right.
like, wait a minute, I can't grasp what's past my lifetime. But I think it's wise to keep an open mind. It might be a little bit easier for you than for me, even with this topic. Or things that are not living being hard for me to look at the same. But it's true. It shapes how we think, how we develop. And I guess that even affects how therapy is done. Do you think though that there's a chance of it becoming a commodity? These platforms, apps, AI now being used more, that it becomes this, yeah, a commodity, as I mentioned earlier, this vulture. And we spoke on this somewhat, but what is the risk of what will possibly be lost? I guess is a better way of saying
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, that's,
What are we losing if it becomes a commodity?
I mean, I think a lot of this already is, and this will be controversial. I think a lot of us human therapists have become commodities to an extent already. Um, if your model that the insurance company allows is you're going to have 8 sessions of treatment, and it's got to be evidence-based and thus manualized to the extent that the therapist is sort of interchangeable, which is what I think the insurance companies would love. Um, and the clients are coming with the idea of, I have depression, back to the self-labeling of the category, then that experience for that patient and that model of therapy is already pretty commodified. The patient has perhaps done this to themselves, or perhaps it happens when they go to see the therapist. They've made themselves less of a whole unique person, or the therapist has by stamping the label on them. And the approach to fixing or addressing that category is, you know, I don't know, DBT, CBT book steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then we've already commodified that. Now, whether that's successful therapy, whether the effects of that are going to be good, don't know. Maybe for a particular person they are, but my preference when I think about the field is that we're having honest interactions. They're deep, they're probing, they're not once you and I build a relationship, I don't say, hey, next Wednesday I'm not going to be here. I'm going to have so and so work with you. You don't get to
Yeah.
be the replacement
No. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
therapist, right? Because we're not interchangeable. Um, so that's again, I think this is already something we're living with in the way that we've commodified ourselves somewhat in this culture or our problems. Now, will this get to be more so if I'm relying on an AI? And I don't know if it's more or less commodifiable or commodified, but it's already a thing that's not a real person, uh, and they might be simultaneously doing therapy with 50 different people or
Oh my
50,000
word.
people.
Yeah, that's true because it's more almost more like an exchange of information. I tell you my diagnosis, you tell me the so and so many steps
Yeah.
to resolve that. My one of my final questions, and I really appreciate your time today, Ben. And for
Mhm.
all our viewers, I encourage and urge you to read his latest work, Hour of the Heart. Stay tuned for what's to come. Go check him out on Instagram. You can find Ben on Ben Yalom Creative Therapy on Facebook and website yalomtherapy.com. I love having these conversations with you, Ben, and I think everyone can take great not just education, information, but comfort and inspiration. Inspiration. So one of my final, if not the final question for you today is, in light of being at this in this twilight zone, if you will, or the
Mhm.
threshold
Yeah.
of what we used to define as meaningful, impactful therapy, and now the digital age and stepping into I suppose these three generations, how can we navigate from an existential standpoint? How can we navigate to make the most of it in the face of these changes that, to a degree, AI being an example, are out of our control? When those fears arise and the what is it going to be like in 50 years and what does this mean for therapy? What can we do to still find meaning in therapy?
Ah, well, that's a very good question. And I think that I can only answer from sort of what I see now, and then hopefully some of it extrapolates out. But my hope with my clients who come in and sort of my vision of therapy overall is that we are looking for very much a connection. Right now, I will call it a human connection, but we can both hold on to that question mark for the future. Um, but we're looking for an intimate connection that allows us to open up to one another in a way that we might not in our regular lives with most people we know. Hopefully, we get better at being able to open up, in the sense that I think what shuts many of us down is various wounds and armor that we develop. Some of that's totally appropriate, but it's important to be able to put it down with the people we want to be able to put it down with. We get a lot of messages constantly from the society around us about what our lives are supposed to be like, what we're supposed to do, who we are supposed to be in terms of everything from gender roles, the need for success, how we are supposed to relate to one another, roadmaps for meaning. Um, and if therapy can do anything, and my hope is that it helps us find what we individually value. Truly, not just the messages we've received, which can be deeply ingrained, but often our sense of discomfort or our sense of crisis, if it comes to that, is rooted in a misalignment in which we think that we're supposed to behave in a certain way because that's what the dominant narratives of our society have told us. And underneath that, usually pretty deeply buried, is what we really feel is important and right in the way people should behave to one another or the way we want to behave in the world. And if we can get to some understanding of that, who you want to be, how you want to behave, how you want to impact the other people around you, That's a good starting spot. And the more you can manifest that, I think the better off in the world you are. And that the aspect of connection, or the aspect of being able to open up and be vulnerable, intimate, is both a critical process in the relationship between self and therapist, or client and therapist, to getting to the point where one can dig for those things. That's important. And then, the hope would be that you can also see how you may or may not be using sort of that authentic vulnerability in your relationships with other people. Because almost always these ideas about ethics, about your underlying values, play out in your life in how you interact with others, particularly those you're close to or want to be close to. So it's a slightly more complex, answer in terms of what the process is. But if you can get that someday from an AI, fantastic. That's wonderful. I don't know whether or not that will be possible. I don't think text-based therapy apps are really getting you to that place right now.
Thank you so much for your time, for your authenticity and the compassion with which you spoke, and the education and intellect. I really appreciate your time today, Ben Yalom. And again, everyone watching, check out the latest book. Stay in the loop for upcoming projects and his next work. And go check him out on yalomtherapy.com. Follow on Facebook, Instagram, possibly a YouTube channel coming soon. We were debating earlier. Go support all those channels. Follow and subscribe. Thank you so much for your time today, Ben, and for just sharing your wisdom, your knowledge on the matter. I'm excited to see what's still in store in your career and with your expertise. I love the blend of the world of art, the artist you are when it comes to theater and all things art, as well as being a healer, the healer that you are. Thank you for what you're doing for this world.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.